everybody. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for attending this evening today. My name is Silvia Mangialene, and I am the president of BC Black History Awareness Society. Before we continue with our program today, I would like to make a land acknowledgement. I would like to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, and ceded territory of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations, on whose traditional territories we operate, learn, work, and organize today. For more than 25 years, the BC Black History Awareness Society has been bringing new events during Black History Month to educate about, honor, and celebrate the contributions, achievements, and struggles of Black Canadians in British Columbia. We believe that knowledge of history is an important mechanism to counteract racism and increase justice and equity for all. Our society has many projects in addition to Black History Month. We are working with the Ministry of Education to increase the presence of Black history in schools. We just finished a new online exhibit for the Digital Museum of Canada on the BC Black pioneers. And we are working with the Royal BC Museum on an exhibit on people of African heritage in BC. Our youth engagement coordinator has planned a series of workshops in hip hop. We maintain an extensive learning center at bcblackhistory.ca. And this is just a sample of projects that we have in our society. This is our second event for the month. Black History Month started in 1926 by an American historian, Carter G. Woodson. The annual commemoration was officially observed across Canada for the first time 25 years ago in February 1996, following legislation introduced by Jean Augustine, the first Black woman elected as a member of Parliament. Black History Month is not just a time to celebrate those from the past. It is also a time to consider how we will shape present and future history to create more justice in our daily lives and institutions. The reality is that much of our history continues to be erased from and made invisible in the mainstream chronicles. While Black History Month cannot replace making knowledge of our history and culture relevant year-round, the spotlight in February can serve as a catalyst to make sure that the contributions of people of African heritage in BC and Canada are acknowledged throughout the year. I would like to introduce you now to our moderator for this event today. Dana Elizabeth Weiner is an associate professor of history at Wilfrid Laurier University. Her expertise is in race, identity, debates over rights, African-American history, and grassroots politics in the US, Midwest, and the West in the 19th century. Weiner's 2013 book about anti-slavery and anti-Black law activism is entitled Race and Rights, Fighting Slavery and Prejudice in the Old Northwest, 1830 to 1870. She has published 2 chapters in edited collections about her current research, which focuses upon race, property, and citizenship claims among free people of African descent in early California. So without delay, I want you to enjoy this evening, and I'll pass it on to you, Dana. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sylvia, and welcome everyone. It's very, very exciting to know so many of you are here to join us today. Even though we cannot see you, we're very excited that you're here. So one of the great things about Zoom is that we get to reach people from all over the place as opposed to just who can personally attend. So let's make this a positive spin on things, right? So before we begin, I also would like to offer a land acknowledgement. This is very, very important in general, and also since the land, place, and mobility are at the heart of our conversation today. So I'm located in southwestern Ontario, and thus I would like to acknowledge that myself and Wilfrid Laurier University and its campuses are located on the Haldeman Tract, which is a traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. This land is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples and symbolizes the agreement to share, protect our resources, and not engage in conflict. The Haldeman Treaty of October 25th, 1784 describes this territory as, quote, 6 miles deep from each side of the river, meaning the Grand River, beginning at Lake Erie and extending in a proportion to the head of said river, which them and their posterity are to enjoy forever. The treaty was signed by the British with their allies, the Six Nations, after the American Revolution, and despite being the largest reserve demographically in Canada, Six Nations now reside on less than 5% of this original territory. I would like to extend my thanks to Paul, to Sylvia, and everyone at the BC Black History Awareness Society, as well as the panelists and performers for sharing their wonderful work with us all today. I love that we're getting to talk about Black history with you here today, and I'm happy to make this virtual visit to the West Coast. So in terms of our overall structure, today we will have 3 presenters and commentary on their work. We will have a musical performance and hear 3 poems. Our panelists today are Adam Aronson of Manhattan College, Stacey Smith of Oregon State University, and Sherry Edmunds-Flett of Simon Fraser University. My fellow commentator is John Lutz of the University of Victoria, and we will have a musical performance from Aisha and poetry from Adeline, the Soul Poet. So in terms of questions, I see people are already using the Q&A, but if you are attending with us via Zoom, you're welcome to enter your questions into the Q&A, which is just down at the bottom of your screen. And we're expecting over 300 attendees here today, so unfortunately, we will probably not be able to get to all of your questions, but we will read them, and we're very much interested in seeing what you have to say. All right, well, our first panelist is Stacey Smith. Stacey Smith is Associate Professor of History at Oregon State University, where she specializes in the history of the American West and the Civil War and Reconstruction eras. She's the author of Freedom's Frontier, California and the Struggle Over Unfree Labor, Emancipation and Reconstruction, book which came out in 2013. This won the David Montgomery Prize in U.S. Labor History from the Labor and Working Class History Association and the Organization of American Historians. Her current project is a study of the Black civil rights struggle in California from the gold rush to the end of Reconstruction. Over to you, Stacey.
Righty, so let me go ahead and share my screen. So hello, everybody. I am very happy to be here, and I will start with my own land acknowledgement. I am located at Oregon State University in Corvallis, Oregon, which is the traditional territory of the Marys River Band of Kalapuya peoples. After the Kalapuya Treaty, also known as the Treaty of Dayton in 1855, Kalapuya people were forcibly removed to what are now the Grand Ronde and Siletz reservations, and are now members of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians. So it's really, again, a great pleasure to be here today. I am really excited to talk to all of you about my research. And as I kick things off today, I will really be talking mostly about the first large-scale migration of people of African descent to what is now British Columbia. And if you're familiar at all with the history of Black British Columbia, you likely know the very broad outlines of this story. In the late 1850s, as many as 800 Black Americans fled California to settle on Vancouver Island or in mainland British Columbia. Now, these men, women, and children were escaping persecution in California, including a new fugitive slave policy and a new Black exclusion law that was pending in the California state legislature. They were also drawn to the Pacific Northwest, the British territories of the Pacific Northwest, as a land of new freedoms. British colonial officers encouraged these migrants with promises that they would eventually be able to buy their own land and enjoy many of the legal and political rights of British subjects in the colony. And this was a really stark contrast to the United States, where the US Supreme Court had recently ruled in the Dred Scott decision that Black people were not and had never been citizens of the United States. And they had, quote, in the famous words of Chief Justice Roger Taney, no rights which the white man was bound to respect. Now, not all of these migrants stayed in the British Pacific Northwest. A large number went back to the country of their birth in the 1860s and 70s. We're going to hear about that later today. And many of them went back to participate in civil rights struggles during and after the US Civil War. So the broad outline of this early immigration, Black Californians fleeing racial persecution, seeking refuge and equality in the British Pacific Northwest, with many later returning to the US to fight post-Civil War civil rights battles, I argue kind of only gets at part of the story. Today, I want to add a layer of complexity and take a somewhat different approach to telling this story. I'm going to be looking at how Black migration to the British colonies of the Pacific Northwest also had important geopolitical implications. And especially I'm going to make the argument that these migrants played a role in the clash between US and British empires in this region. And specifically, I'm going to talk about how Black migrants and British colonial officials created a military and political alliance aimed at stopping US territorial expansion into British Columbia and Vancouver Island. So Black Californians who considered leaving the United States in the late 1850s sought not only to escape the geographic boundaries of the United States, they wanted to do that, but they also wanted to escape being forced back into the United States by aggressive US territorial expansion. That is, they didn't want to resettle outside of the United States only to have the US come and seize their new homelands in a war of territorial conquest and then subject them to the same racist anti-Black laws that they had tried to flee from in the first place. So when, let me advance my slide here. Ooh, I'm still getting used to this. So when Black Californians first met in San Francisco in the spring of 1858 to discuss their options for settlement outside of the United States, they originally considered actually moving to the northern Mexican state of Sonora as one of the possible alternatives to Vancouver Island. So they ultimately rejected this idea of resettling in Mexico because white Americans were already targeting northern Mexico for conquest, right, for territorial expansion. Not only had the United States already seized much of northern Mexico, including, of course, California, in this recent war of territorial aggression, Americans in San Francisco had sent 6 different filibustering expeditions to Sonora in northern Mexico between 1850 and 1857. And so these filibustering expeditions, if you're not familiar with the way I'm using the term here, these were essentially unauthorized paramilitary raids that were aimed at seizing territory outside of the United States, either for the United States or often for private interests. And so there's a strong possibility that the Sonoran government would be overthrown and the Mexican state of Sonora annexed to the United States. And this possibility eventually convinced Black San Franciscans to kind of cross Sonora off their list of potential migration destinations. In contrast, Vancouver Island in British Columbia seemed far safer from US imperial ambitions. The United States' most famous Black civil rights activist, somebody you've probably heard of, Frederick Douglass, was not a fan of resettling abroad. He did not like the idea that African Americans would flee the United States. But he admitted that Vancouver Island, British Columbia, would at least be a safe haven from American expansionism. He wrote, "This territory, thank God, does not belong to the United States and is not likely to be annexed. It is British soil." And he said that, he basically was optimistic that the British would fight off American expansion in British Columbia and also protect Black migrants from white Americans who came into the colony trying to pass anti-Black legislation. So in short, Black migrants may have found Vancouver Island and British Columbia colonies appealing, not just because they were a refuge for civil rights, but also because they appeared to be strongholds against aggressive US territorial expansion. Now, British colonial officials did not share Black Americans' confidence that the British Empire would be able to hold on to its Pacific Northwest colonies in the face of mounting US pressure in the Pacific Northwest. If you know this history, which I'm guessing many of you do, after, this is just a decade earlier, the United States had seized almost half of the British territory along the Pacific coast of North America. Thousands of US migrants to the Oregon Country in the 1830s and the 1840s had really protested against the joint occupation of this territory with Great Britain, and they helped to force the United States to pursue a boundary treaty in 1846. Now, although Americans didn't get the entire Oregon Country, they secured all of the territory south of the 49th parallel, including the rich Columbia River Valley. Okay, and so essentially they'd already wrested a lot of this territory away from British control. And now this discovery of gold in mainland British Columbia really revived American hopes that there might be a possibility to conquer or annex all of this British territory along the Northern Pacific. There were, for instance, in the late 1850s, a series of boundary disputes over the San Juan Islands in Puget Sound. And one of these disputes almost erupted into war in 1859, an incident called the Pig War. And I could talk more about the Pig War in the Q&A if you're interested. And this left British colonists and especially colonial officials in almost kind of constant dread of a US military invasion that might be aided and abetted by recent American arrivals, gold miners who flooded into the gold country in British Columbia. And we can sort of see that that fear, that anxiety, in the words of the British governor at the time, Governor James Douglas. And here's how he put it. He said that newly arrived Americans would, quote, always be a hankering in their minds after annexation to the United States. And with the aid of their countrymen in Oregon and California, so near at hand, they will never cordially submit to British rule, nor possess the feeling of loyal British subjects. Now, so in short, colonial officials who worried about the British Empire's sort of fragile hold over the Pacific Northwest and these territories had a mutual interest with Black migrants from California. They both wanted they both really wanted to keep Vancouver Island and British Columbia out of American hands. And in fact, Governor Douglas's formal invitation to Black Californians to migrate northward in the spring of 1858 may have had, really a goal of mutual defense in mind. He noted with approval that unlike white American gold seekers who came into this territory, Black Californians expressed their sincere willingness, quote, to transfer their allegiance to this country, quote. So in the late 1850s and early 1860s, Governor Douglas and the colony's new Black residents from California built an alliance against US territorial expansion. In the summer of 1858, Governor Douglas recruited Black newcomers to serve on a multiracial colonial police force that was primarily made up of British and US-born men of African descent. A major goal of this police force was to keep the peace among rowdy white American miners who passed through Victoria and to basically kind of prevent them from getting out of hand. White Americans did not take kindly to this, and in fact, they mobbed and beat two of these Black policemen, and Douglas was forced to disband this police force to stop white Americans from continuing to riot. A more permanent alliance came in really in the 1860s. And in 1860, Black expatriates from the United States demonstrated their new loyalty for the crown and the lack of sympathy and sort of fear of American expansionism by starting their own volunteer militia company that was aimed at protecting the colony. The officers of the Victoria Pioneer Rifles, which were the first such militia on the island, lamented, quote, the strong American element which had entered into the community, quote, and they pledged to aid the British government in overpowering the American invaders. They would, quote, resist any American aggression toward the colony and promise that, quote, if Uncle Sam goes too far, we shall be able to give a good account of ourselves. And Governor Douglas was himself enthusiastic for this military alliance, at least at first. And it was probably no accident that he officially swore in the Victoria Pioneer Rifles into the Queen's service on July 4th, 1861, which was, of course, the 85th anniversary of the United States rebellion against Great Britain. Since I'm running close to the end of time, I just want to sort of point out that Black migrants to California had also built a political alliance with Governor Douglas and what ended up being his political party known as the Government Party, which was basically made up of royally appointed members of the colonial government, such as himself, and officers of the Hudson's Bay Company. And while Douglas helped them to become naturalized British subjects, they eventually got the right to vote, and they helped keep him in power and the Government Party in power against the rival Reform Party, which was a kind of an upstart party that was trying to challenge the really strict, strong control of the HBC and the Crown over the colony. But with the help of these Black voters, right, this was something that Governor Douglas was able to stave off to basically kind of prevent this from happening. So Black voters were very strong allies, political allies for the Crown. What happened, though, is, at least I argue, is that this alliance really started to fall apart in the 1860s over an issue called the Alien Act, right? The Alien Act was essentially a law, colonial law, that allowed African Americans to become naturalized British subjects. Okay, so they could naturalize, go through that process and become British subjects. At the same time, this law restricted office in the colonial legislature only to natural-born British subjects. Okay, so you had to actually be born in the British Empire. You couldn't just be a naturalized British subject in order to serve in the colonial legislature. And this ended up being an enormous disappointment for African Americans who had become British subjects. The Government Party refused to budge on this. The Government Party believed that if naturalized British subjects were allowed to serve in the colonial legislature, then this would lead to an American invasion of the colony. Essentially, that white Americans who were always after and trying to annex or conquer British Columbia would naturalize, become British subjects, get into the colonial legislature, and then essentially take over the colony and vote to annex it to the United States. So the government party wouldn't budge on this. And we have some contemporary accounts that Black British subjects from the United States, that this is one of the key things that really broke their political alliance with the government party, with Governor Douglas. And some of them even mention it as a motivation for eventually going back to the United States, where they could, in fact, hold political power and office, at least by the end of the 1870s. So I'm over my time. I'm going to go ahead and stop there. And I want to, again, thank everybody. I can talk more about this, especially this end part that I had to rush through in the Q&A at the end.
All right, thank you very much, Stacey. All right, now I am excited to introduce our musical performer, who is Aisha Kay, who is an upcoming singer, songwriter, and poet from Vancouver. Aisha was born in Philadelphia and raised in Vancouver with a Nigerian background. Her genres include R&B, rap, and soul with touches of jazz and blues. Aisha's passion for music only continues to grow, and she hopes to share her sound with the world. She's singing a song today called Souls.
Hi, everyone. Very nice to be here and be a part of this. So yes, today I will be singing a song called Souls that I have written. I wrote this around the time when there were a lot of protests in Vancouver, and I was alongside other people that were helping organize. So I decided to put what I had learned, what I noticed, and with everything going on in the world, I decided to make a song about it. So yes, this is the song. Every day I wake up just to see another body shot down right in the middle of the street. I pray for change here every day, but soon enough we won't have a Black culture here to save. Losing people one by one, even though we stand on the other side of the gun. I won't be small, no, I won't hide. 'Cause if I die, I'd rather die standing with my pride. Another soul down, another soul taken from this world, another soul, another person that was taken way too soon. Another soul, another one, another taken by the God. We will stand, we will march until this war is done. If they're $1, I'm a dime. They get off and I spend my life doing the time. And if I scream, no one will hear. They make our voices disappear. We might be scared, but we'll never ever be a stranger to fear. Another soul down, another soul taken from this world, another soul, another person that was taken way too soon. Another soul, another one, another taken by the gun. We will stand, we will march until this war is done. I can't breathe, I can't breathe, I can't breathe, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. Another soul down, another soul taken from this world, another soul, another person that was taken way too soon, another soul, another one, another taken by the gun. We will stand, we will march until this war is done. I got a message from my ancestors, yeah, from the people up above. Just know that they're watching and that they're never giving up. I got a message from my ancestors, yeah, from the people up above. Just know that they're watching and that they're never giving up. Trayvon Martin, Keith Scott, Stephen Clark, Ayanna Jones, Michael Brown, Jordan Davis, Breonna Taylor, Freddie Gray, and the list goes on. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I really appreciate you listening to my song. That means the world to me. Thank you. Clapping, I can hear you clapping. Thank you.
I'm so sorry that we can't clap properly for you. That was so beautiful. Oh, wow. All right. Well, guess need to roll crisply along here, but thank you. All right. Well, I would now like to introduce our next panelist, who is Adam Aronson, professor of history and director of the Urban Studies program at Manhattan College. He's the author of 2 award-winning books, The Great Heart of the Republic, St. Louis and the Cultural Civil War, and Banking on Beauty, Millard Sheets and Mid-Century Commercial Architecture in California. He's co-edited 2 books, Civil War West, Testing the Limits of the United States, and Frontier Cities, Encounters at the Crossroads of Empire. And he's published a half-dozen scholarly articles as well. Aronson's written for national media and spoken about his research in numerous academic and public history settings. His current research is on African North Americans who crossed the US-Canada borders during and after the Civil War, and on mapping their networks.
Thank you. I'm coming to you from Lenape land on Manhattan Island in New York City. And it's an honor to join all of you in presenting and discussing these important topics. So you heard from Stacey about some of the earliest period when it comes to the history of African North Americans and British Columbia. I wanted to take the next step of that story, and my presentation really is part of a project that thinks about all of the US-Canada borders from Alaska to the Maritime provinces. So the overall project tries to really pull from lots of different archives. I know you won't be able to read all of these words as they go by, but I've been working to speak to both individuals from these communities, community historians, and descendants of fugitive slaves in Canada. I met with Karen Hoshaw when I was in British Columbia back in 2014. I've been at this for a while, and I've thankfully had the opportunity to have funding from a number of different sources in the US and Canada to work on this project. Hopefully I'm more than halfway towards the end of it. My goal is in trying to find different ways to get access to the experience of African North Americans, people who lived on both sides of the US-Canada border, whether they were well known and we have photographs and we have narratives from them, or whether we really only know them from government records. And one of the things I'll show you as we move along is that I've been working a lot with databases and visualizations to help us see the patterns of how all these groups come together. I know I'm throwing lots of names at you, but I just wanted to acknowledge the teams of students and colleagues and funders that have been part of this work so far. Okay, so when I say African North Americans, what do I mean? I tend to mean people who were alive at the time of US emancipation, at the end of the US Civil War, or with a memory of emancipation, who grew up in families where that reality of recent emancipation was something that would have been talked about and known, really, part of their daily life. The other thing is I'm talking about people moving in either direction, right? So as you saw from my title, After the Underground Railroad, I think a lot of the time we focus on certain periods in the history of African American history, either in the United States or Black Canadian history. There's certain moments that all of it's important. I think it's important for us to tell all these stories, but the reality of slavery in New France is something that I think is still a surprise to people, and so it gets focused on. The Simcoe Act and the eventual end of slavery in Canada. The Underground Railroad, I think from an American perspective, is the thing that people most think of when they think about the experience of Black Canadians. And then the period in red, which is what I'm focused on, I think actually gets a lot less attention, starting with World War I and starting with the migration of people from the Caribbean and the British Empire into Canada, and then the civil rights fights in Canada after that point, I think is something that gets focused on more. But the period directly after the Civil War up through World War I is really the period that I think often gets focused on the least. And I think that's what my project really wants to focus on. As I said, I'm focused on the experience of the border in Ontario, whether with Michigan or with Buffalo. I'm focused on the experience of the border in the Pacific Northwest with British Columbia, and also in the New England area in relation to the maritime provinces, as well as Alaska if it comes into the project. So many Canadian borders with the United States, and not trying to act like this is one experience, but really a variety of experiences across all of these connections. We've already heard a little bit about the Pioneer Rifle Company and that initial moment when those who had come from California engaged with Governor Douglas and his own experience of having a mixed race background and how that played out in terms of the colonial history of Vancouver Island and what becomes British Columbia. One of the leaders in that group was Mifflin Wistar Gibbs, a man who had been born free in Pennsylvania, had gone to California, actually serves in the legislature in British Columbia, serves at the Yale Convention as part of Confederation. And then when he comes back to the United States, he actually ends up with a judgeship in Arkansas and eventually serves as ambassador to Madagascar. He writes about a 500-page memoir that talks about his experiences all the way up through Teddy Roosevelt. And he has a very short paragraph talking about his experience of coming back to the United States. He says, "En route, my feelings were peculiar. A decade had passed, fraught with momentous results in the history of the nation. I had left California disfranchised and my oath denied. I was returning and on the touch of my country's soil to have a new baptism in the all-pervading genius of universal liberty. I had left politically ignoble. I was returning panoplied with the nobility of the American citizen." So Gibbs is among a group of people who actually have really high hopes for the idea that Reconstruction will succeed. Marianne Shad-Carey is another person who moves to Washington, advocates for DC statehood, advocates for voting rights for women, goes to Howard Law School in this period, right? Some of these fights, unfortunately, we're still fighting, right? But they're very hopeful in the 1870s that Reconstruction will really mean a meaningful change. They don't necessarily see it, but I think they represent this political hopefulness. On the other hand, there are many other people with African North American experiences that are actually very far from politics. John Sullivan Dees, this is, as far as I know, the first salmon canning label that exists. And it was created by Grafton Tyler Brown, an African American, for John Sullivan Dees, an African North American who was canning in the Fraser River. He does so for a little while, and then there are a number of other folks come in, and the competition gets too much for him. Dees actually then goes to Oregon and dies of probably a metal poisoning linked to all that canning. Grafton Tyler Brown has a history of painting in British Columbia, and then he goes back into the United States and actually passes as white in the Yellowstone area. When he dies, he's listed as white, which is common in a number of the people I'm looking at. Lots of the things that when I talk about the census change, right? Their birth dates change, the way they spell their names change, even sometimes their racial categorizations change, either of their own doing or because the census taker would just look at people and sort of guess based on who was in the family. So finding this information, understanding its complexity is part of my project, and thinking about the way people had experience on both sides of the border that created networks for them that they were able to use and make connections. One of the most important kinds of fraternal connections were through groups like the Prince Hall Masons. This is a funeral for a member of the Alexander family on Vancouver Island on the left, and then Arlie Robbins from the Buxton community on the right, representing the kinds of organizations that, though secret, actually published newsletters, had numbers of letter collections go back and forth, had conventions, right? And so we can see a whole connection, sometimes religious, sometimes political, sometimes just sort of social, through these connections and through these images like this, right? Bringing together dignitaries from a larger group for something like a funeral or a parade. So this is an image from the City of Victoria archives, again, of sort of the power of family and everyday life, right? I mean, some of you may know the people in this photograph, but the experience just of living as a Black Canadian, having these connections either recent or further to the United States, and then later to the Caribbean and to Africa, thinking about how the experience of African North Americans, like many people of the African diaspora, is really that of movement and of network, and of having both an origin place and a destination, and maybe a place where people are just in the middle as they think about it. These are all ideas I'm wrestling with, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the Q&A. There are folks though where we don't even have photographs, we don't have letters, we don't even necessarily know much about them. And this is an early visualization of my efforts to track people that I'm finding, in this case in Ontario, and see where they moved based on government records, census records, marriage records, death records. I'm going to focus in my time today on a few cases that touch British Columbia out of this, and not in this visualization, but in my overall research. And then Sherry after me will talk about families that stay in British Columbia, I think more than mine, who often cross the border. So a few of those individuals, and just to give you a sense of the variety of these experiences. This man, Elias Toussaint Jones, you can see there was an obituary published when he died in Oberlin, Ohio. He was born in Raleigh, North Carolina. He had come to Oberlin with his parents. He attends Oberlin College, which is one of the few colleges that accepts African Americans before the Civil War. You can see in the bottom corner there maybe that he's listed as a gold miner in Barkersville, British Columbia, right? He actually goes twice between Ohio and British Columbia, chasing gold. And if you can see in that bottom corner, that's a probate will in terms of certain property he had owned in British Columbia that actually isn't even resolved in his family until after his death, okay, in 1917. So though he is born in the 1830s, he goes in the 1890s, meaning in his 50s and 60s, to British Columbia, to Barkersville, and as part of the mining experience there. So a different moment than what we had talked about earlier in terms of the 1850s. You may know of Samuel Pierre or other members of the Pierre family. His parents had been born in the Virginia, DC area, and died in British Columbia. He was born in British Columbia in 1872 in Victoria. His wife, one of his wives, is from the Chatham community. They end up living in Tacoma, Washington. And you can see that he and his brother served as tailors there. And you can see his very proud photograph that we see on the side there. I have two more examples I want to share now. And again, this is just kind of opening up the kinds of connections and the kinds of stories I'm trying to recover out of the census records and other experiences. This family, the Besselou family, as you'll see on the next slide, sometimes called the Besselin family, he had been born in South Carolina, spent time in the whaling world. So in Massachusetts, in California, in Kamchatka, near Siberia. It doesn't say Victoria, but you'll see on my next slide why I know he had spent time in Victoria. And then finally, in Oregon. You can see that he is marries a woman from Nova Scotia who he meets in the Boston area, which again showing one of these other ties across the US-Canada border in the Black community that I'm trying to learn more about. Besalou, it said on the previous slide that he had a son named James Nelson Besalou, but apparently in other records he's known as James Nelson Besselin, and records in his own family show that he was born in British Columbia in 1868, suggesting his father and mother lived there as well. When his father moved to Oregon, James moves to Oregon as well. He marries Clarissa Jane Clanton, who's from a Victoria family. And you can see that we have records showing them in different areas right around Portland, Oregon, and Clackamas, and in Vancouver, Washington. So these networks, right? Part of what I'm trying to do with those big charts is to find networks and nodes, right? Find experiences where are there communities of people who had this experience of living on both sides of the border, and what did it mean for them, right? If the US story is often that Underground Railroad meant, safety and freedom forever, Frederick Douglass, as we heard from Stacey, says that, British Columbia is safe from American racism. The experience in Canada was not that it was safe from racism. And I think that understanding how people use the border as they made these connections is one of the things I really, I want to learn more about, and I'm trying to research. Thank you for listening.
Great, thank you very much, Adam. All right, so our next presenter is Sherry Edmunds-Flett, who is a doctoral candidate in history at Simon Fraser University in Burnaby, BC. Her PhD thesis is on the history of African Canadian women in British Columbia from 1858 to 1938. So we have gone in chronological order, as you can see. She graduated with her master's degree in African Area Studies from UCLA, and her MA thesis was on the history of slavery in the Kingston, Ontario, and Bay of Quinte region. Sherry is the executive director of LANC, Link, Long-Term Inmates Now in the Community, which is a nonprofit registered charity that she founded with her late husband, Glenn Flett. All right, over to you, Sherry.
Hi everyone. We're here at Emma's Acres, the Link Social Enterprise Farm. And what I would like to do is to acknowledge that we're on the unceded ancestral and shared lands for the Stolo people. Our municipality is on the Kwantlen, Lacamo, Matsqui, and Skowlitz territories. And I would also like to acknowledge the ancestors that came and their descendants in 1858 and onwards. I mean, I appreciate the information that they've been sharing to me, and it helps me become a better ally, because that's what I see myself as an ally. So my paper is basically part of my thesis research, which is on the history, as I said, of women of African descent in British Columbia. So the province's 19th century African Black community was largely concentrated in and around the city of Victoria, in Vancouver Island, and on rural Salt Spring Island. Smaller numbers settled in towns and cities dotted along the banks of the province's inland waterways and the trails and wagon routes established during the gold rush periods. Many of the women who migrated to British Columbia during this period came with middle-class families that had a father or a husband with a trade that could afford them the opportunity or the choice to work within the home, raising their children and taking care of the household. Migration occurred within the province as well, as women, their spouses, and families moved from place to place, taking advantage of economic opportunities to better themselves. So it's difficult to know exactly how many Black women migrated to Vancouver Island during this initial settlement period. However, 140 women of African descent I identified as immigrating to Vancouver Island and neighboring Salt Spring Island during the first decade of settlement from 1858 to 1868. I know the birthplaces for approximately 110 of these women. Just over half, or 89 of them, were born in the United States. The majority were born in southern slaveholding states. For those women that were born in northern free states, The majority came from Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, the District of Columbia, New York, and New Jersey. 7 women were born in Victoria prior to the immigration to British Columbia. 12 women were born in what is now known as the province of Ontario in Canada, and 4 women came from the West Indies. Most first-generation women were involved in long-lasting, stable marriages interrupted only by the death of a spouse. Many were married to businessmen or tradesmen who achieved relative economic prosperity, employed as merchants, tailors, restaurant owners, bakers, draymen, carpenters, contractors, and porters. This enabled them to the opportunity to live out the Victorian ideal of separate spheres. As part of the household economy, women contributed to the family income doing such things as taking in boarders or doing piecework, growing vegetables, as well as raising poultry or livestock. And so these things are often invisible. So at least 26 of the identified women were widowed before the age of 50. Most of them lived in Victoria, needing to support themselves and other family members. Like their sisters elsewhere in Canada and the United States, they found work in the service sector as domestics, laundresses, and cooks. Often a widow would have more than one occupation in her lifetime. Rebecca Gibbs, who was widowed at the age of 56, was a writer as well as a nurse. Other women, such as Mary Jane Hamilton and Adelene Phelps, ran boarding houses and took in single men and women as lodgers. Widows such as Sarah Smith, who took over her husband's steam bakery after his death, were rare. I only found one identified widow, Julia Hernandez Travis, who owned property in her own right prior to her marriage. In 1853, she left Jacksonville, Florida, with her sister Mary to join other family members who had arrived in California the year before. As Delilah Beasley stated in her book, Negro Trailblazers of California, when the Fraser River Gold Rush excitement reached California, the sisters decided to go to British Columbia and cook at a wage of $100 a week. Think about that. 1858, they're getting a wage of $100 a week. Julia Travis prospered since she was listed in the Government Gazette as owning a portion of 5 acres on Pioneer Street in Victoria. Becoming a widow sometime before 1881, Mrs. Travis was continually employed as a cook and laundress, which are jobs of low pay and status. She was, however, still an influential woman within the Black community, witnessing wills as Julia Travis, property owner. Living and working and participating in colonial society, the men and women and children of Victoria's Black community drew sustenance from each other by living in the same neighborhoods, marrying within the community, and by supporting its organizations. Now, we go to pictures. Okay, excuse me, share screen. Okay. Okay, so during the 19th century, single, married, and widowed first-generation women, as well as other members of Victoria's African-Canadian community, lived in close proximity in the Johnson and Yates Streets wards. They often inhabited the same houses for generations. The Pierre family lived at 22 Pioneer Street for at least 30 years, as did the Pointers at 193 Johnson Street and the Lesters at 93 Vancouver Street. And this is a picture of Nancy Lester Nee Davis, who was the wife of Peter Lester. And she wrote a letter to abolitionist William Still before they moved from San Francisco. Her and her husband and kids moved from San Francisco to Vancouver Island. And she told him that the reason why she wanted to move was to find a place for their children, a good place for their children to live. So anyways, unlike I should say, many Black people elsewhere, African Canadian women on Vancouver Island were actively engaged in efforts to uplift the race. So like, for instance, they publicly supported and raised funds for the Pioneer Rifle Corps, which were mentioned earlier. The Committee of Colored Ladies, as they called themselves, took their responsibilities seriously. In 1863, for example, they held a donation party on New Year's Eve to raise money for ex-slaves in the United States. The women cooked for and participated in the annual Emancipation Day celebrations, enacted in dramas at the Pioneer Hall. Most child immigrants were born in the eastern and southern United States where their parents had formerly lived. A handful came from communities in Canada West, or Ontario as we now know it, with an established Black presence. Growing up in Victoria, daughters of first-generation women, including Mary, Cecilia, and Corinthia Pierre, attended the Ladies' College or Girls' Collegiate School, better known as Angela College. Black children and youth continued to study in integrated classrooms, often garnering praise for their efforts. Before marriage, a number of young women were enumerated as living with their parents or a widowed mother. Employed mainly as nurses, dressmakers, servants, or waitresses, they contributed to the family income. 16-year-old Ida Barneswell, who boarded at her parents' home, was a dressmaker at Mrs. Crabb's in Victoria. After graduating from school, Emma Travis, daughter of Julia and Augustus Travis, became a housemaid. Emma Stark Clark, who completed her education when the family moved to the Cranberry District, was teaching at the North Cedar School in 1874 at the starting salary of $40 a month. Cecilia Frances Smith, daughter of Moses Rose Smith and Sarah Smith, was a music teacher. She actually went as well to the Royal Conservatory of Music in Toronto. So she was classically trained, and Cecilia was a pianist and music teacher for her whole life. Even though, let's see the next one. Even though children attended integrated schools with their families, and worshiped at local churches, their social activities were largely centered within the African Canadian community. As Mary Barneswell, and this is a picture of Mary Barneswell, knee low, pointed out to her daughter Ada, it didn't matter if people were racist. The rich social life of Victoria's Black population gave her enough around her own to do. Ida spoke of crowded get-togethers in the family home at 1148 Johnson Street, where her oldest brother would play his violin and a friend would be on the piano. A local Black string orchestra played dances at the Gorge Pavilion. Throughout the latter part of the 19th century, most African Canadian women on Vancouver Island married within the local Black community, creating extended kinship ties that made nearly everybody a relative. For example, the Barneswell sisters, Ada and Mary Louise, married brothers Charles and Frederick Alexander. Corinthia Pierre and teamster Thomas Alexander wed on February the 2nd, 1887. Mary and Flora, daughters of Moses and Isabella Roden, married two other Alexander brothers, William and John. Like their mothers, most married daughters were listed as homemakers or housewives in the census records. These daughters were also concerned about the conditions for people of African descent as a whole. The Pacific Appeal, which is a Black newspaper out of San Francisco, dated April the 25th, 1863, reported that the untiring ladies are always seeming and devising some plan to relieve the sufferings of the sick and indigent. They have founded a new society named the Daughters of Victoria, numbering 19 members with all necessary officers. Its leading features are benevolence and charity, and its aim is to administer aid and comfort to the sick and needy. This is a picture of the home, inside the home of Sarah and Moses Rose Smith. And the piano you see was probably the piano that their daughter, this is Lena, actually practiced and used. So anyway, so then the daughter of William Henry Miller, who immigrated to Vancouver Island in 1858, Mary Anastasia Miller, met her husband-to-be John Fremont Smith in Victoria. 5 years after they were married, Smith, his wife Mary, and their daughter Gertrude left Victoria and were on their way to pursue economic opportunities in the British Columbia interior. In 1882, the Smith family was first living in Linton and then Lewis Creek. By 1891, the Smiths were living in Kamloops. John Fremont Smith and Mary Anastasia Smith were actively involved in community life there. John helped to establish the Agricultural Association in 1895 and the Kamloops Board of Trade in 1902. He was elected to City Council in 1902, a position that he held until he was defeated in 1908. John Fremont Smith was the Indian agent for the Kamloops Agency from 1912 to 1923. Mary Anastasia Smith's community efforts were largely focused around church work. She was a loyal member of the Sacred Heart Roman Catholic Church in Kamloops. So this is a family picture that was taken just before their son, Leo Alphonse Smith, who's right there behind his father, went off to World War I. He died overseas. And one of the Smith daughters, Agnes Christina Smith, actually went and got her degree from UBC. And she later moved to California, where she was a teacher and where she had her children, got married, had her children, and passed on. So with the majority of married, single, or widowed women living within city limits, only a small number worked alongside their husbands on family homesteads. Sylvia Stark, nee Estes, and her mother, Hannah Estes, were the only two women who immigrated to Vancouver Island who I could clearly identify as being born in slavery. In 1849, Howard Estes, her father, went to California to earn the money necessary to buy his family's freedom. 2 years later, after the family was freed, the Estes traveled overland by covered wagon to California in 1851. Sylvia met her husband, Louis Stark, and married him in Placerville, California in 1855. 2 children were born prior to the family's 1860 immigration to Salt Spring Island with Sylvia's father, mother, and brother. 5 more children were born on Salt Spring. According to Ruth Sandwell in her book, Contesting Rural Space, Land Policy and Practices of Resettlement on Salt Spring Island, 1859 to 1891, the African American or the people who are of African descent on Salt Spring Island was significant. They made up 17 out of 95 preemptors, or just under a fifth of the preemptors residing on their land before 1868. By 1868, she said, African Americans, including the Starks and Estes, owned most of the land in the fertile valleys stretching between Ganges Harbor and Vesuvius Bay. Farming was a family affair for the Starks. Everyone pitched in. During the epidemic of 1862, Lewis came down with smallpox. While he lay delirious for several days, Sylvia milked 14 cows, looked after the pigs, did the work inside the house, and looked after the children. Sylvia was proud of her work ethic. And in this picture, which was taken of her at 92 years of age, Sylvia was sitting on a chair, wearing an apron with the basket of apples from her orchard beside her on the ground. As she told the photographer who took this picture, she wore her apron as she was a working woman and proud of it. 30-year-old Harriet Harrison Hogan Staff Nee Copeland immigrated to Vancouver Island and then to Salt Spring with her first husband, William, parents Abraham and Ellen Copeland, and her siblings. Ellen Copeland, by the way, was the oldest woman that I found having immigrated to what we now know as Vancouver Island or BC, and she was, I think, 56. They arrived on Vancouver Island from the province of Ontario sometime around 1864. On May the 11th, 1864, William Harrison applied for 50 acres of land in the Ganges Bay settlement. It was there that Harriet was living when William passed away suddenly on July the 25th, 1878. About 14 months later, she married again, this time to Englishman Alfred Staff. The couple was farming on Vancouver Island in 1881, but were living in Victoria in the Yates Street ward with Harriet's son in 1891. However, by 1901, 67-year-old Harriet Staff Nee Copeland was listed in the census as a farmer, was back residing on Salt Spring Island, living with 2 of her sons, William and John Harrison. Now, Nancy and Charles Alexander left their hometown of St. Louis, Missouri, and traveled overland to California with their first two children in 1857. A year later, in 1858, they came to Vancouver Island on the steamer ship, the Oregon. In 1861, Charles bought land in Shady Creek in South Saanich. Settling there, the Alexanders farmed for 33 years. A deeply religious family, they helped found Shady Creek Methodist Church. Nancy was a founding member of the Lake Hill Ladies Institute. Married for over 50 years, Nancy and Charles Alexander were parents of 12 children. Now, there were enough people of African descent residing in New Westminster, which is on the Lower Mainland, to warrant the city's own subscription salesperson for San Francisco's black newspaper, the Pacific Appeal. Incorporated as a city on July the 16th, 1860, New Westminster was located about 18 miles west of Dees Island on the north side of the Fraser River. Sawmills and salmon canning were the city's two primary industries. Josephine Sullivan and her husband Philip were two of New Westminster's early black pioneers. They had moved to British Columbia from the United States with their oldest children, Julia and John, in 1859. Deeply religious, such as the Nancy and Charles Alexander, they had moved to British Columbia from the They had attended Wesleyan Methodist Church located on Queens Avenue, and this church is still standing. Their two youngest children, Arthur and Charles, were born in New Westminster. Arthur and Charles, by the way, signed the Articles of Incorporation for the city of Vancouver. Anyway, the Sullivans, Philip, Josephine, and their sons, John, Arthur, and Charles, lived in New Westminster for 20 years, and by 1882, the family had moved to Vancouver. So, as the 19th century came to a close, a growing Vancouver challenged Victoria's preeminence in the British Columbia economy. With lower freight costs, better connections to inland, as well as coastal trade, railway, and lumber production, it became the provincial hub. Mirroring this economic shift, the center of British Columbia's African Canadian community moved from Vancouver Island, Salt Spring Island, to Vancouver. According to Dr. E.E. Maciel, who was touring Vancouver Island and the Lower Mainland in 1893 in the hopes of establishing the AME Church in British Columbia, 165 people of African descent, including seniors and children, lived in Vancouver. His informal census included 19 barbershops, 8 janitors, 1 elevator runner, 1 restaurant, and 1 varnish manufactory. The railway made it much easier for couples and those with families to make the trek from central Canada to the west coast. One of those families included were Martha Scurry, her husband Hiram, a barber, and their children. And they had originally started out from Owen Sound, Ontario. In 1886, Hiram and Martha Scurry traveled to Vancouver with their 7 children from Winnipeg, working and buying property in East Vancouver. After her husband Hiram died in 1895, Martha provided furnished rooms at 228 Abbott Street, next door to the barber shop that her sons owned and operated. So in conclusion, the province's 19th century Black community was largely concentrated in and around the city of Victoria on Vancouver Island, Salt Spring Island, and New Westminster, later on into Vancouver. Taking advantage of economic opportunities to better themselves, women, their spouses, and families moved from place to place. Many of the women who migrated to British Columbia during the 19th century came with middle-class families that had a father or husband with a trade that could afford them the choice to work within the home, raising their children and taking care of their household. Only a small number worked alongside their husbands on family homesteads. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Sherry. I'm now very pleased to introduce today's poet, the spoken word artist, Adeline, the Soul Poet. She was born in San Francisco, raised in Vancouver, and is a direct descendant of 2 of BC's Black pioneering families. Her great-grandparents left San Francisco and settled in Victoria and Salt Spring Island in the mid-1800s. Her grandmother was also famous in Vancouver's history. She opened and operated Vi's Chicken and Steaks from the early 1940s until the late 1970s. The restaurant was a fixture on Union Street in Hogan's Alley and was a home away from home for visiting Black performers. So we're very excited to hear from you today.
Okay, you got me? Okay. Am I? Okay. It was different back in the day. The people, the neighborhood, from the corner of Main to the alley on Union, that's where you'd find the spot. Vi's Chicken and Steaks was pretty hot. Oh yeah. My grandma owned the joint and ran it first class too. T-bones, porterhouse, filet mignon, and half a chicken was the meat on the menu. Biscuits that were homemade, baked fresh every day, melt in your mouth and sold out quick because grandma didn't play. That's right, she sold it. With mushrooms, onions, peas, salad, and fries. And that was the complete menu when you came to Vi's. The hours were 5 at night till 5 a.m. But after midnight, it was always strong. There was no liquor license, so folks had to bring their own along. My grandma supplied the ice in the mix and would always take a minute and sit to have her a drink or two. Oh yeah. The cops would come in after their beat. The cabbies would come in off the street. And the entertainers back then, when they came to town, would walk through her doors. Well, grandma didn't mess around. That's right. Ella Fitzgerald, Lena Horne, Earl Grant, Duke Ellington, Billie Holiday, Diana Ross and the Supremes. Vi's Chicken and Steaks was a hot part of that night scene. And there was a time when Jimi Hendrix's grandmother worked with mine. Now, I remember Rosie, the dishwasher, and Leah, the waitress. Everybody was friends. My grandma hired only women, even way back then. And the laughter would be jumping all night long up out of that place. First class dining at Vi's Chicken and Steaks. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And we are fortunate enough to get to hear 2 more poems after our Q&A period. So please do stick around for those later on.
Right.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so what we are doing now, just a quick reminder, folks who are on Zoom, you are welcome to enter in if you have questions for the panelists. If there's anything you'd like them to elaborate on about their research or thoughts it provoked in you, please feel free to post those in the Q&A. We are going to do a very brief commentary here. So let me introduce the other commentator, who is, of course, John Lutz, professor of history at the University of Victoria, where he teaches British Columbia history. He's particularly interested in the effects of racism and resistance, and he's the author or editor of 5 books, as well as numerous articles and book chapters. He's created a website about the murder of Black men on Salt Spring Island in 1864, and an exhibit and website about, we heard about briefly from Adam earlier, about the Black artist Grafton Tyler Brown. He feels blessed to be on sabbatical in this year of plague, and while other people are adopting dogs and cats, he's adopted 30,000 honeybees as his COVID hobby. So John is going to start us off with his comments.
Thanks very much, Dana. And I'm so pleased to be part of this event and so pleased to have music and poetry included along with these wonderful presentations. I live in Victoria. I have some property on Salt Spring Island, and so I feel like a foothold in traditional territories of several Coast Salish nations, but also in the 2 centers of historic Black settlement in British Columbia. So it really is a pleasure to be learning alongside all of you about these pioneering settlers today. I also want to say thanks to the Black History Awareness Society for inviting me. Also, thanks to all the presenters who've given us such a rich banquet of prose and poetry and song to celebrate the long-standing history of Black Canadians and Black British Columbians. I'm going to offer just the briefest commentary to leave lots of time for questions about these papers that we've heard. But I want to start with a bit of a really quick alternative history question, or a kind of what we call in history a counterfactual. So the counterfactual is, if gold had not been discovered in British Columbia in exactly when it was, April 1858, that meant that the Black migrants who came in this group starting in 1858 through the early 1860s would not have arrived alongside 30,000 American miners who were headed to the gold rush. Instead, this 700 or 800 African Americans would arrive in a colony in which they would have consisted of, there would be more African American adults than other non-Indigenous adults in British Columbia. In other words, they would have dominated the colony in terms of their population, in terms of adults. So if not for that historic accident at the time, and the Black migration and the gold rush happened to coincide, our history of British Columbia would be very different. I was invited onto the panel to make a few observations about the papers that you've heard. Each of them enriches our understanding of this little known migration, a migration that Stacey has pointed out has significance way beyond our parochial city of Victoria and Vancouver Island. All of the presentations point to the multiracial origins of British Columbia, which included, of course, mixed race Indigenous families, lots of Indigenous, dominant Indigenous population in the 1850s and 60s, Hawaiians, immigrants from China, among others. All of the presentations pose a question in some way of why the Black migrants either did not stay in their adopted home, or why they've melted into the melting pot of Canadian settler society without leaving a stronger record. The focal point of all of the papers on these Black migrants is totally appropriate for today's events, but they raise questions for another day about how to think about the Black migrants as part of a wider colonial project, including, of course, Chinese migrants, but dominated by settlers from Europe. And all of these immigrants displaced Indigenous societies, Indigenous ownership, Indigenous people. These questions ask us to think about the complexity of colonialism and the role played by populations fleeing persecution, poverty, famine from one location, and the role in displacing and creating new poverties in, among others, in their new home. We can't blame the Black migrants for displacing Indigenous people, but neither were they innocents in that colonial process. Turning to the particular presentations we've just heard, thanks very much to Stacey Smith, who offers us, I think, a new and important explanation for one of the reasons why we have this Black remigration to the United States. By looking at the African American press in San Francisco, she's been able to identify a new, I think, explanation for why so many African Americans returned home, and points to the Anti-Alien Act of 1861 that soured African Americans on the British colony. You know, I'm sure this is partly true and part of the explanation, but the historical record leaves us so many puzzles. The evidence that Stacey draws on shows how racism in British Columbia was a live issue and helped contribute to that remigration. Yet Mifflin Gibbs and others who left the colony praising the British for their comparative lack of racism. And we know that by the time 1869 Mifflin Gibbs returned to the United States, the Ku Klux Klan was already active, assassinating Black and white supporters of Black franchise, Black freedom, and that the returnees would have been facing much harsher racism in their original homeland. I wonder if, as Reconstruction era ended and Jim Crow set in, whether some returnees regretted their decision and communicated that to friends and family who remained in British Columbia and who remained longer for that reason. Thanks also to Adam Aronson, who offers us a preview of a very ambitious project that will shed light on a period of African American and Canadian history that's so far largely a blank slate. By looking at this period, he'll reinsert Black history into Canadian and American history. And you know, we know, for example, that migration from Canada to the United States was a huge factor in the late 19th century. In fact, there was more emigration from Canada to the United States from 1860 to 1900 than there was migration into Canada from Europe and other places in that same period. More Canadians left than arrived. And so for Adam to integrate the Black history into that larger history, I think would be really, really valuable. And then finally, thanks to Sherry Flett for her wonderful glimpse into the lives of African-American women in British Columbia. She's offered us a kind of a group biography. And I was surprised by the number of women she identified that we might call middle class or even upper class among these very recent immigrants to British Columbia. In 19th century, the middle class was a much smaller element of population today than it is today. It's a much larger leap from working class to middle class. And to find so many, if you like, middle class African-American women was a surprise to me. Also interesting, and this comes out a little bit in her oral presentation, more in her written, about how much of the population stems from other places besides the United States, so Caribbean or Eastern Canada. I wondered in what ways their lives were different from their white female middle class counterparts, and whether and how racism structured their lives. So for Adam, a question maybe you can think about, and we'll just leave this for the, I think the open question period if he wants to respond then. Was the Victoria migration was it unique to have a group of people move in a large number from the States in an organized fashion, or was this part of many things? For Stacey, I wonder about whether she could think about why, even facing more virulent racism, so many returned to the United States. And for Sherry, I wonder what proportion of women were middle class and what proportion were working class in your studies. So I'll stop there and let Dana sort of offer her comments.
Great, thank you very much, John. All right, so so many things to say, and we want to definitely make time for you in the Q&A, so I will be brief. So thank you so much to all of our presenters and our wonderful performers for sharing your thoughts and your insights. I love the connections that people are drawing among the different ideas here today. Really love seeing the new light your research shines on the histories of the African diaspora and British Columbia's roles in these histories. I think all three of the presenters here today expand historians' perspectives on Black migration and Black communities. And for me, their presentations provoked many questions about agency, transnational movement, imperial rivalries and strategies, and colonialism. So I think these projects very much shed light on BC as a place of potential access to citizenship and greater rights than Black people could claim elsewhere at the time. They certainly also contribute to ongoing conversations about transnational Black civil rights movements. Here we see such vivid details about the lives of Black people built in British Columbia going up to the early 20th century, and their creativity in devising strategies to improve their circumstances when they encountered persistent discrimination issues. Stacey shows us African-American migrants' collaborations with British colonial officials against potential US expansionism. Black people in British Columbia were making strategic alliances, using imperial rivalries for their own benefit. And Mifflin Gibbs is a wonderful example of somebody who strategized and changed over time in keeping with his environs and their changing attitudes toward African Americans. Going quickly over to Adam, your research breadth is so impressive, and there's so much going on across the entire border, US-Canada border here. But so I'm very much looking forward to hearing more about what your findings teach us more broadly, but about African-American agency and the importance of these histories. But just to focus in for our purposes today on BC, I'm wondering about the economic status, what you've been able to find out about people's economic mobility, just because that was such a sticking point for many African Americans in the 19th century. Getting enough capital to be able to move around was often challenging. So, and this may be something I know this isn't present in all histories, but I'm curious what your sources have enabled you to find out about people's economic status that allowed them to be going back and forth, or drove them in some cases from one place to another. And then moving over to Sherry, this fascinating picture you paint for us of the early African Canadian population in BC. It's just wonderful, rich, detailed research that's really showing us how clearly how Black Canadians built communities and thrived in early BC. I was particularly intrigued by the example of the Copeland family and others you mentioned who moved not from outside Canada, well, present day Canada, but who moved from other regions of British North America. And I wondered to what extent was BC kind of a magnet for people of African descent from elsewhere within British North America, if you've found many cases about that. That would be neat to hear about in the Q&A if time permits. So I'll just wrap up with one big question, giant, ridiculously large question, which is just how ought we to think about these individuals and movements in the broader context of the African diaspora in North America and beyond? And so what does knowing more about Black British Columbians teach historians, both of Black Canadians and the global African diaspora? So yeah, we will leave you with that. So I don't know if anyone, I think probably our best way of starting off the Q&A is maybe just to go around in panel order. If anyone has anything that they really want to say in response to what John and I just said for a few minutes. And then we can also bring in audience questions after everyone's had a chance to offer some thoughts. So Stacey, are you ready to begin?
Yes, making sure I had unmuted myself. So the question about why migrants to British Columbia might have been interested in going back to the United States, even though there's this obvious racial, intense racial violence in the aftermath of the Civil War. One sort of answer to that is that I think that a lot, the initial enthusiasm, so it's a matter of timing. The initial enthusiasm is happening during the war itself, and that there isn't quite the sense that there's going to be this racist, violent backlash that did eventually happen during Reconstruction. So a lot of the people who are very excited about going back to the United States were expressing those views right around the time of, let's say, the Emancipation Proclamation, where in 1863, when there seemed like a lot of hope and a lot of possibilities. And Abraham Lincoln was still alive, and there were lots of potential moments for transformation that people were seeing, right? So maybe in retrospect, and maybe other panelists have found this, maybe in retrospect, there were people who regretted coming back to the United States, but I haven't found that. Generally, the folks that I'm looking at in California pretty avidly participated in California civil rights struggles and politics after the Civil War. A lot of them who had even become British subjects formally kind of didn't tell American authorities about that and were voting as U.S. citizens, which is pretty interesting. So I will stop there and let other folks chime in.
Sure, I'll just add a little more. I think part of what made British Columbia different was because it was a mining frontier, right? And it was so tied into the culture of the Pacific, where, in Ontario, it's mostly agricultural communities. I think there is something to be said for group migration in terms of how it creates a moment in time, kind of a flashbulb memory, if you will. And we see that in the Exodusters, we see that in Amber Valley in Alberta, we see that in the Buxton community, we see that with the Black Loyalists. So there are other moments, but there are lots of individual migrations also. And I think that British Columbia, the history after, Stacey said she's not aware of any, but I think after Reconstruction, you do begin to see people go back, people who had spent some time in British Columbia or in Ontario elsewhere, like we saw with Elias Toussaint Jones, as I mentioned. He goes back a few times, right, into a new mining frontier in British Columbia, hoping for a new opportunity there. So I think the community of Black British Columbians in the 19th century are extremely mobile, right? That they're really almost global in their thinking. There are definitely people who go from California, Black people who go from California to Australia, to British Columbia, for example, right? So that there are these ties, especially on mining frontiers in the Pacific.
Hi, it's Sherry. So first I wanted to there was a comment that was made in the Q&A by Mr. Pierre, so I wanted to address that. I wanted to talk about how I became an African Canadian historian. So when I was 13 years of age, I lived in Ontario in a place called Kingston. I went to a public school named Collins Bay Public School, and my class was an all-white class, and I didn't know any person of color. And my teacher said that any Black person of any worth had to have white blood in them. And so I said, I disagree. I'd read the autobiography or the biography of Martin Luther King by his wife, Greta Scott King. I got kicked out of school. So when I was 13, I'm now 62, I decided I wanted to become an African Canadian historian. So basically, I became that. I had to go outside of Canada to study about people of African descent in Canada to UCLA. I've been now doing the work I've been doing about African Canadians in British Columbia because there hasn't been other people doing it. The first, like in terms of academics, the thesis was done by Pilton in 1952 and 1950, I believe. And so it's just sort of new. There's been some work done, but not a lot. And my work is first and foremost for the community. And I also think it, as I was saying in my presentation, makes me a better ally. Like the work I do is within prison. And so where I met my husband, who was serving a life sentence, was in BIFA, Black Inmates and Friends. And we have always worked and looked at the impact of white supremacy and white privilege in the wider community. And so I think that my learning about people of African descent in Canada has helped make me a better ally. But I totally agree. Hey, you know, all of the panelists were white. The two performers were people of African descent. Would have been cool to have somebody that was of African descent on the panel, but it didn't happen. And in terms of the migration, as was pointed out, the migration goes back and forth, back and forth. The Pacific Northwest was very porous. And so people would go up to Canada, would go back down to the United States, back up to Canada. And I have found that in my work, I have 16 volumes of genealogies. I know Adam went through them when he was staying at my house. And so how I track it is by family genealogy. So part of it was the movement within the community for economic opportunities. Part of it was if you're basically married to everybody in the community, you basically then married somebody that was part of the community, let's say down in Seattle or other places, like some of the Pierre family members were in Seattle, or, you know, and again, we had organizations like the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. We had our club membership in.
Sherry, I think you hit the mute button there.
There. So it was, again, the migration was very porous. And what I was trying to do was to look at migration as it pertains to people of color, but specifically in terms of women and their children, which again points to that whole intersectionality and, you know, looking at gender, class, and race. Anyway, that's my points.
Great, thank you, Sherry. We have a few, I can kind of roll together a couple of the questions we've gotten in the Q&A. So there was a question asked in response to Stacey's presentation about whether why, we can put this under the category of why Canada or present day Canada, why BC. So was Mexico not an option because it was hostile to Black people at the time? That was the question that was originally posed. But perhaps several of you would be able to speak briefly. We have about 3 minutes left for our Q&A. Briefly about you know, what it is that's so attractive about British Columbia, if there was anything that you weren't able to say in your presentations earlier on that subject.
And a lot of folks had asked in the Q&A about why I didn't talk about Governor Douglas's African ancestry. I was actually getting to that at the end and ran out of time, but to sort of point out that one thing that's very interesting and important about BC is that the mixed race heritage of its own governor made the colony especially welcoming to people of African descent. It was sort of from what I understand, an open secret in this era that Douglas himself had African parentage. It's one of the things that the Reform Party that attacked him politically would bring up constantly. And this may also be another reason why Douglas was especially sympathetic to the migrants from California, and why he was very, very eager to help them get British subjecthood and be naturalized. But sort of my point at the end was going to be, there was only so far he's willing to go. He's worried that white Americans are going to take advantage of the alien laws in order to, essentially overthrow the colony. And so that was sort of the attention that I was hoping to explore more at the end. Yeah, so that's, I think, one of the important reasons why British Columbia is much more appealing place than some of the other areas that they consider going.
All right, does anyone have anything else they wanted to comment about those sort of pull factors? Or John and I also have some additional brief questions. I don't know, John, is there anything else that you wanted to bring up?
Yeah, I guess if Adam can, I would love to hear more from Adam about the larger patterns that he sees in the migration. So is there, where's the main direction of movement after the Civil War? Is it south? Is it north? Is there patterns that he can point to from his research so far, for example?
Yeah, so from what I've found, there's definitely more people coming south from British North America into the United States. I think the way I'm building the project is looking at the political movements, as I mentioned, around Reconstruction, but also we see lots of economic movement, people finding jobs in the Ford Motor Company, for example, in Detroit, people making connections for education or for marriage, as Sherry was talking about also. And I think one quick thought is that someone had asked about, so how should folks in 21st century British Columbia, Black British Columbians think about this? As historians, that's always a little bit of a challenge, right? But I think our story of the past is not just about what happens in the past, it's about how it informs the present, right? And I think like Aisha's song earlier, I think helped think about those connections, right? When is something a pattern, right? When is something being forgotten or being remembered? And I see the importance of the idea that there were Black members of the legislature, right, of the city council, of the legislature, Black people in Victoria who were rich. The first Black canning label, the first canning label for anybody, I think, was John Sullivan Dees canning label, right? A Black Canadian creating the first canning label in the salmon canning world, right? So I think there are lots of things that people think of as not linked to this Black Canadian history that really is part of the Black Canadian history of Black British Columbia. My research ends around World War I, right? So that's a long time before the present. But I think that the questions and the struggles, right? The fact that some of these struggles continue now and that they're still unanswered and they still feel unfair, I think is part of how this history can inform the present.
Right, thank you. I wish we had another half an hour to hear more thoughts about everyone about your research and draw these connections out, but perhaps there will have to be another event in the future. But thank you very much to all of you for sharing your work with us. And we're lucky to also be having 2 more poems to close out our event today. So please give your attention back over to Adeline, the soul poet. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, I get it. It's for the Black pioneers of BC. It's called You Ain't Gone. You left me hanging. What could I say? You went and died on me that day. And now that you're gone, what do I do? How do I make it in life without you? And why? Why is it that you still talk? I hear your voice upon my walks, fussing, bossy, telling me the things I need to hear. You ain't gone. You see, I feel your presence. Your spirit is strong. I know these feelings I have aren't wrong, because I laugh when I hear the things that you say. I answer you back as I go about my way. I thought I had lost you. That's all I envisioned. But I thank God for giving us this beautiful, beautiful connection. Because now that I know it, this is cool. Because you left me the biggest part of you, the gift to realize that we're still together. That's right. That's spiritual power. That's it. I was so afraid when you were gone, but I didn't know the spirit power holds on. So I look forward to awakening and spending my day with you in my mind, with you in my way, laughing with you now as you laugh too, because we both know we've got separate things to do. Me on this end, I'd say it's the lower. You on that high road, because you done crossed over. Hand in hand and side by side, God chose you to be the guide. So I'm not alone, as I thought at first. Those were just emotional bursts. What's happening now is a stronger force. Subconscious spirit knew this, of course. You were chosen. So you go head on. I'll be all right, because you ain't gone. That was my poem to them. This is their poem to me. I'm right here in heaven, and I'm all right. There's people coming through all day and all night. They come when it's time, the young, the old. In heaven, there are no lost souls. The people here are from all over the world, babies, old folks, little boys, little girls. Imagine the catastrophes, the diseases being spread, the senseless killings and wars, leaving so many dead. You'd think it would be crowded, but really it's not. We all have our corners, our so-called spots. We keep a lookout as far as can see, watching those souls marching in constantly. And sometimes we gather to talk amongst our own, because you see, here in heaven, you ain't never alone. We're waiting and waiting to see who comes through. We're waiting for you and you and you. And when it's your time to come this way, be ready, be happy, because you come into play. Because right here in heaven, we're having a ball. We are having a ball. We just laughing and talking and waiting on y'all. Thank you. Whew.
Thank you very much. I think you've ended things on a perfect note for our celebration of Black History Month here today. And so thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. My family that was born and raised in Victoria and came up from California in 1858, they're with us now. I had to get it right.
Well, thank you.
But thank you all. It was very, very interesting and very, very, the amount of information that all of you have brought in has just made it that much better and that much open for people to participate that want to participate with their history in Canada. Yeah.
Well, thank you. So just to remind everyone, you can certainly, if you want to see future events from the Society, if you were just learning, you can see on your screen here, bcblackhistory.ca. And there's always ongoing events with the society happening. And there also will be a recording if, I don't know if it's been showing up in the chat, but I've been posting the YouTube link there that will show up in a few days on the website as well, if you would like to look at this presentation again. And again, thank you to our wonderful performers and our presenters, and to Paul and Sylvia for getting us all organized. And thank you all for your attention. I hope that this will create some more fruitful conversations in the future, and have a wonderful evening.